Okay, good morning. I'm Lucy O'Brien, teach evolutionary psychology. Well, hopefully everybody knows where they are. Today I'm just going to lecture a brief overview of what is the field of evolutionary psychology, what are its basic principles, and what are the types of psychological studies that you'll be learning about in this class, so you can decide whether or not you want to take this class. That's all my information if you want to contact me. The course website contains all of the readings, but you need to put in a username and a password to get them, because I'm not really supposed to put them up there. The username and the password are both spaces. I'll post all of this on the My Aberdeen site. But if you email me 2 days before the exam and say, what's the password for the website so I can get the readings, I will know that you've done no preparation whatsoever. So remember that. All right. So evolutionary psychology is actually more of a branch of biology. And it uses the logic of natural selection to help us to understand human social behavior. And the logic of natural selection is really, really easy, actually. I know lots of you probably don't have biology backgrounds, but there's just three main principles that if any system has these principles, you will get evolution through natural selection. So the first principle is that organisms produce more offspring than can possibly be supported by the environment. So not every individual in a species who's born can survive to reproduce. The second principle is that there's variation in how well suited individuals are to their environment, and that this affects their chances of survival and reproduction. So some of the individuals who are born in a population are going to be better at surviving and reproducing than other individuals. And the third, really most important principle is that some of this variation needs to be heritable. And by heritable, I mean that it can be passed down from parent to offspring. Usually when we talk about this, it's through genetic means. But there are some formulations of natural selection about how ideas propagate, that even social behaviors, things that are entirely learned and have very little genetic component, can also be subject to natural selection in this way if they're produced, if this variation is heritable. But for the most part, in psych, we're going to talk about genetically heritable variation. So as long as some of the reasons that individuals are better or worse at surviving and reproducing are things that they inherit from their parents, and as long as you have these three principles, then in that system you'll get evolution by natural selection. That is, any of these heritable variations in the phenotype. And the phenotype is just what you express. So we contrast that with genotype. Genotype is what kind of genes you have. And they influence how you develop and what kind of traits, physical traits and mental traits that you have. And those are your phenotype. So the phenotype is a product of the interaction between your genotype and your environment. I'll talk about this a lot, especially in the kind of common misconceptions of evolutionary psychology. Is one of the ideas that evolutionary psychologists believe that genes control all of our behaviors, and that the environment and learning have no place in influencing our behaviors. And all phenotype is an interaction between genotype and the environment, and learning is part of that environment, especially for social behaviors. But, okay, lost track here. Okay, so, as long as there's heritable variation, if your phenotype is influenced, you inherit it from your parents, and that influences how good you are at reproduction. Then, if you have a phenotype that's good at reproduction, you'll have more babies. People who have a phenotype that's bad at reproduction will have fewer babies. The next generation will have more individuals who have inherited that phenotype that's good at having babies. And fewer individuals will be born who have a phenotype that's bad at having babies. This just seems incredibly logical, yes? That if you have a physical trait that makes you poor at having babies, there will be fewer individuals in the future who have that trait, because you can't produce as many. And there'll be lots of individuals who have traits that help them to have babies. And that's all that natural selection is, that after many generations of this, the population will come to be dominated by individuals who've inherited traits that make them good at having babies. So we're really, really focused on reproduction in evolutionary psychology. You might have heard terms like survival of the fittest and thought that natural selection is all about survival. Survival is an incredibly important prerequisite for having babies. If you're dead, you can't have babies. But just surviving, living to 500 years old without having any offspring, who in the future population is going to have your excellent genes for longevity? So survival in and of itself, if it's not a means to increasing your reproduction, can't actually be selected for. And when we talk about the chapter on health, we'll talk a little bit about senescence and the idea that actually just through accidents, predation, etc., you're more and more likely to die as you get older. And you might expect under some circumstances for natural selection to actually decrease your lifespan if it gives you benefits early that help you reproduce more. It might actually be beneficial to live a shorter length of time rather than to live a long length of time if the trade-off is that you have fewer offspring. So basically, this is the organizing principle of all of biology. It's how we understand all physical and physiological aspects of organisms and also behavioral and social aspects of organisms. So it's only natural that we should be able to apply this to human behavior. So what can evolutionary theory tell us about behavior specifically? It's usually pretty easy for people to see how we can use those principles to understand how lungs evolved or how the heart evolved or how the eye evolved. But to understand how behavior evolved and why does it matter how behavior evolved and what can it tell us? One thing is that evolutionary theory can help us to generate and evaluate hypotheses. So I talked about reproduction being the main currency of natural selection and not survival. So you might be, if you were looking at a behavior that decreased survival from a kind of a theoretical viewpoint, you might be surprised why would a behavior decrease survival. But using an evolutionary perspective, you might say, well, if it's decreasing survival, I'd expect that maybe that if that behavior isn't entirely maladaptive as sort of accident or an influence of the environment. If it's a behavior that's widespread and seems to be normal in a population, you'd expect that there to be some sort of reproductive trade-off. And it helps you to think about that and to evaluate whether or not hypotheses about behavior are plausible. Should humans do X or do Y? If you think about the reproductive benefits to those behaviors, it can help you to figure out, is this behavior maybe a typical behavior in humans? Could it be a variant of behavior? Or maybe a maladaptive behavior that is caused by novel environments? We'll go through a lot of that pretty soon. So that leads on to the second thing that evolutionary theory can help us do is to recognize these different types of behaviors, things that are currently adaptive, things that were adaptive in previous human environments, but maybe not in our novel current environment, and things that are byproducts of adaptive behaviors. So what are examples of this? Currently adaptive behaviors are all the really obvious things that help you to survive and reproduce. So parental behavior, social grooming behavior, foraging, eating behavior, mating behavior. All pretty obviously adaptive, all obviously help us meet this end of surviving long enough to reproduce as much as we can. But previously adaptive behaviors are where we need to think about the environment, the past environments that humans and our ancestors evolved in, and how our current environment is different. We're unique among most species in that our current environment is incredibly different to what it was even 1,000 years ago. But when we talk about past human environments and the environments in which humans evolved, there's a lot of different things that you mean by that. So if you want to talk about the human visual system, the environment in which our visual system evolved goes back millions and millions and millions of years, well beyond the first Homo sapiens or the first even Homo erectus. Our visual system is in common with most all of the mammals and doesn't have a lot of extra special functions that other mammals don't have. So when we're talking about that environment, it's the environment that the ancestor of all mammals evolved in. and even for basic visual functions, maybe even the ancestor of all vertebrates. But when we're talking about certain more uniquely human aspects of our behavior, like language, then we're talking about somewhere within the last 6 million years, that environment where language evolved in a uniquely human form. So don't get stuck in this idea of, if people talk past human environments, it's not just the place, the scene. It depends on which aspect of your behavior, your physiology that you're talking about. But so here's one really good example, easy to understand, of a previously adaptive behaviors. Most everybody here probably quite likes candy and sweets, etc., probably more than you ought to. And a desire to overeat fats and sweets was almost certainly pretty adaptive when there weren't very many, there weren't candy bars on every corner. And if you're going to overeat sweets, all that meant was you're going to eat all the fruit that was available when it was in season, and which is generally pretty good for you. So our new environment, where high fat, high sugar, low nutrient food is readily available, gives us a maladaptive environment in which we use our adaptive behavior of eating all the fats and sweets that are available to cause a maladaptive consequence. Another potentially previously adaptive behavior that people have hypothesized is an inclination to delay childbearing. So there are lots of evolutionary psychologists that are interested in the demographic transition when, say, societies get more industrialized. People tend to go from having fairly large families, about as large as they can handle, down to about 2 children each in each family. And there's an idea that this is a byproduct of a previously adaptive behavior to regulate your family size based on how competitive the environment was and how crowded it was, and then also when survivorship is high. If you're pretty sure that your children aren't 50% of them going to die from malaria, then you can have fewer children to start with, and that we may have psychological adaptations to respond to these cues in the environment that children aren't dying very much and it's very competitive and the world is crowded, to regulate our desired family size or behavior that ends up in family size. But that the kind of ridiculously crowded cities that we live in and the very competitive environment and the extremely low child mortality rates that we have actually, that our behavior is now not adaptive in an evolutionary sense. So when I talk about adaptive behaviors, I mean behaviors that maximize the number of offspring that you have relative to other people. I don't mean that these are morally desirable behaviors or that we as a society want people to be doing adaptive things. I'm just simply talking about the logic of natural selection. And certainly, we may, as intelligent people in the society, decide together that what's an adaptive behavior, having as many offspring as possible, isn't a desirable behavior for the society, and that we can look into the future and see what the negative consequences would be and not want to do that. Whereas natural selection doesn't look into the future. It simply responds to gene frequencies in the population. So when I talk about things like desiring fewer children being maladaptive, I don't mean it's morally bad or that I think that people should desire more children. So that simply, in terms of natural selection, it's maladaptive. Right. This third category of types of behavior that we can talk about is byproducts of adaptive behaviors. You might also hear these behaviors called spandrels, which are these kind of little triangular bits in between. If you've got 2 arches, the bit in the middle is a spandrel, and sometimes it's decorated. And I don't know much about architecture, but Stephen Jay Gould coined this phrase of spandrels, that they're not actually a design feature. The spandrels don't help keep the structure up or anything. They're just there because they're in between 2 adaptive structures, the 2 arches. And that you might be able to think of some behaviors as sort of being a byproduct of other adaptive behaviors. We're pretty sure that there's not been much, if any, natural selection on the ability to read. There's not been written language for very long, so the ability to read probably hasn't doesn't have a genetic basis that increases or decreases your fitness. And fitness is another kind of technical term, but it just means your reproductive success. Or say, riding a bicycle. Most people can do it. Doesn't mean it's an adaptation, that we didn't have natural selection in the past that favored people who could ride bicycles and didn't favor people who couldn't ride bicycles, but that this is a byproduct of something else that we've had natural selection for. Probably some combination of balance abilities that we have due to walking, and other kind of navigational abilities that we have maybe for navigating when we're going fairly fast, like when running. But that they've all come together to have a specific behavior that we might perform now, but that behavior's, in these cases, really clearly not been selected for by natural selection. But in other cases, it's not quite as clear. And those are some of the things that we're going to talk about in this class, is how do we set up studies? What kind of evidence do we need to look at to decide if a behavior is an adaptation or a currently maladaptive previous adaptation, or one of these spandrels or byproducts of an adaptation? All right. You may hear lots of criticisms of evolutionary psychology, generally because of a lot of misunderstandings of what are the principles of evolutionary psychology and what is it that we do. One of the recommended readings for this lecture is a paper that I wrote for The Psychologist a few years ago called Beyond Just So Stories, and it details a lot of these criticisms and explains and gives examples of how they're incorrect. So I'd recommend reading that. But I'll go through these a little bit fast here. So evolutionary hypotheses are always just so stories. What I mean by a just so story, so this is one of the criticisms that I really don't think is true. But a just so story is just a story that you make up after you've heard about a behavior. You think, what do people do? People tend to be jealous when their partner cheats on them. And so I'm going to say that, well, I know that behavior is there, and I'm going to make up a story that explains why that behavior was adaptive for reproductive success, that people who weren't jealous in the past, their partners would just leave them and they didn't care, and then they'd have lower reproductive success. And it's a common criticism that you hear that evolutionary psychology is just people sitting around looking at behaviors we already know about and making up stories about why they might have influenced reproductive success in the past. And there certainly is a bit of that, but that's the first step in almost all psychology, is to think about what's the behavior that we want to investigate further, and what are our hypotheses. So all hypotheses are just so stories. They're just ideas that you had that your best guess at how to explain something. But then the next step that's critical for all psychology is to test those ideas. And evolutionary psychologists do this just the same as everybody else. So then they use the principles of natural selection to make further predictions about, well, if we think that people who don't have jealousy, who don't have this emotion of jealousy, are going to have lower reproductive success because their partners will be more likely to leave them. We could test that. We could go out and try to measure people's jealousy. We would predict that people with lower levels of jealousy would have, their partners would leave them sooner or more often or something, or that they might have fewer children, although that might be modified by our current environment where people had very few children anyway. But you can come up with then hypotheses and predictions that are based on your evolutionary hypothesis on your just so story, and see if they're right or not. And if they're not right, then you've falsified your hypothesis. And that's our second common criticism, that evolutionary hypotheses are unfalsifiable, that you couldn't possibly come up with any reason to say that an evolutionary hypothesis is untrue, and therefore it's not science. So if you ever have a hypothesis that's impossible to disprove, it doesn't belong in science, which is why we tend not to investigate the kind of the grand questions. Does God exist? Are there ghosts? Because those questions, by their very nature, you can't falsify them. By the nature of those things, we can't actually find any evidence that proves that they don't exist, and therefore they're not scientific questions. And so some people have said evolutionary psychology is the same. You couldn't possibly, if somebody said, this hypothesis that I made up off the top of my head about jealousy, if it was impossible to disprove, then we shouldn't be studying it. But it is possible to disprove because we can come up with predictions based on that hypothesis and see if they're correct, see if they're incorrect. Another criterion, we talked about the 3 principles of natural selection. One would be that the behavior, the phenotype needs to be heritable, inherited from the parents. We would maybe then want to go and look to see if variations in jealousy are heritable. Are people with very jealous parents also very jealous, and people who are less jealous tend to have less jealous children? If we find that this behavior is totally not heritable, that you can't inherit it from your parents, then that would also rule out that evolutionary hypothesis. So there are a lot of different avenues of research that you can use, and that's one of the things that I like best about EvPsych. So you can do genetic studies, lots of twin studies to look at behavioral genetics of behavior. We can do experimental psychology studies, looking at how people react to stimuli and see if they do it in line with predictions or not. We can do cross-cultural studies, although let's get all of these out. So one other criticism of psych is that or a misunderstanding, is that it predicts that every human being has the exact same evolved psychology, and that we should all behave in the same way. And clearly that doesn't happen. So people use that as evidence to reject evolutionary psychology, that it must be wrong. And it certainly isn't a prediction from any evolutionary hypotheses of human behavior that we should all behave in the same way. One of the main things that we do look at in EvPsych, especially in my lab, is individual differences. How is it that we have behaviors that let us respond contingently to the environment? So if you're in one circumstance, you behave in one way. If you're in a different circumstance, you behave in another way. So we can also do cross-cultural studies to see people in this certain environmental circumstance, are they behaving in one way in response to that environment, and people in another environmental circumstance behave in a different way in response to that environment. One of our lectures will go over some cross-cultural research looking at things like social behavior, people's moral ideas, their sexual behavior, and how they're related to pathogens in the environment, and pathogen levels that differ between different countries. So that's kind of related to this third criticism that EvPsych is intrinsically racist, classist, sexist, homophobic, etc. Which comes from the idea that EvPsych might predict that everybody should behave in the same way, and that there's kind of one correct way, and that we should all behave in this one correct natural way. Which leads me on to the other idea, what we call the naturalistic fallacy. Talked a little bit before about if something's selected, if it's adaptive, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's morally correct or desirable. And if you make that confusion, we call it the naturalistic fallacy. So there's a evolutionary biologist named Randy Thornhill who wrote a book about sexual assault. It was called Rape, and went over sexual assault or sexual coercion in lots of different species, and then made some predictions about what sexual coercion might be like in humans, and what adaptive functions it might have. And certainly, it sounds, if you were making the naturalistic fallacy and thinking that adaptive means good, that's just absolutely reprehensible. But in no way were they doing that. And we're saying that perhaps sexual coercion increased the reproductive success of certain individuals in certain environments in the past. But maybe it didn't. And this is what we would expect the human psychology of sexual coercion to look like if there was any natural selection involved. And this is what we'd expect it to look like if it's entirely a maladaptive behavior that's caused by developmental problems in individuals or by the environment. And just laying those ideas out in no way makes any moral judgment about whether, if we did find that sexual coercion was an adaptive behavior and that some of the psychology involved in that had been selected by natural selection because it increased somebody's reproductive success in the past. Clearly, that doesn't make it good. That actually gives us some more understanding and might let us help to solve the problem. The better we understand these sorts of behaviors, the better we can understand what are the environmental factors that influence them. Can we remove those or change those environmental factors to decrease the behavior, rather than bury our heads in the sand and say, this is such a horrible behavior that we're not going to study it, we're not going to understand it from a biological perspective. So I want you to be really careful to not commit the naturalistic fallacy when you hear about a behavior that might be adaptive. Nobody's saying that it's necessarily good or necessarily bad. Try to be sort of non-judgmental. I'll talk quite a bit in one of the lectures on violence about infanticide, which is a really fascinating area. Actually, I talk a lot about homicide because my PhD supervisors did lots of research on homicide. Not in the idea, actually, that homicide's adaptive or that people have psychology that's specifically designed to help them think about killing other people, but that it's more of the tip of the iceberg of conflict. And if you want to study human conflict, then if you study homicide, that's a really good, cross-culturally valid, well-recorded statistic that you can get in order to do these studies. It's quite hard to hide homicides, whereas getting statistics about lower levels of violence, abuse, or male-male competition fights, there's not such good stats on how many guys are fighting, but there's pretty good stats cross-culturally on who's killing who. So that's why I'll talk about homicide an awful lot in later lectures, because it's a really good window into psychology and a sort of measure that you can use to test a lot of these hypotheses about human cooperation and conflict. The last idea, sort of fallacy of evolutionary psychology, is that it's too reductionist to explain human behavior using evolutionary theory. That we're humans, and we have learning, and we have culture, and big societies, and clearly we have no biological urges, motivations. We've divorced ourselves entirely from what influences behavior in every other species on Earth, and that we're unique among all species, and that we have no biologically based behavior. Have you ever done something that you didn't want to do? Eaten something that you knew you weren't supposed to eat? Not studied for an exam, went out, partied when you knew you should have been studying? Do you think that you have total control over your behavior and that there's no, I don't want to say biological urges because I'm getting into some less scientific territory there, but I really do think that we can understand human behavior by drawing analogies and parallels with other animals' behavior. And certainly we do have unique aspects of culture and society and language and cognition that other organisms don't have. And we'll talk about that as well. What can evolutionary theory tell us about the origins of more uniquely human behaviors? But I think having a basis in looking at the behaviors that we share with all other organisms, and if it's helpful to use evolutionary theory to understand, say, mating behavior in all other mammals, we can probably use some of that information to help us understand our own mating behavior, our own parental behavior, our own social behavior. So that's when you hear about reductionists, it's the idea that we're just trying to explain behavior based on genes and nothing else, and that actually humans are way more complicated than that. And actually, we'll find a lot of examples where humans aren't any more complicated than other organisms, and that we behave to the same stimuli in the same way as chimpanzees do, or as a stickleback type of little fish do. All right. So these are another thing that I really love about ev-psych, or evolutionary approaches to human behavior, is that it's not just psychology. It covers a really wide range of disciplines: medicine, biology, anthro, experimental econ, psychology, and neuroscience. And we'll talk about all of these in this class. We'll do some cross-cultural research, anthropology. When we talk about human cooperation, I'll explain a lot of studies that use experimental economic methods. We've got 2 whole chapters on medicine. I know it's a psychology class, but most people actually like that lecture most. So I do one lecture on we'll call it Darwinian medicine, or what can the medical sciences learn from an evolutionary approach to disease. And that segues into another lecture on mental disorders, and how can we understand mental disorders from an evolutionary perspective as one of those three categories, either potentially adaptive behaviors, previously adaptive behaviors, or spandrels, byproducts of other adaptive behaviors. So their idea is that depression actually is adaptive, has functions that, although unpleasant when you're in the middle of depression, are actually beneficial to you as an organism, to your long-term reproductive success. Sort of like pain. When it's very unpleasant when you burn yourself, but that pain makes you retract your hand, stops the burn, has very good functions. Pain's got a great function to stop you from hurting yourself further, even though it's incredibly unpleasant while it's happening. So, again, adaptations aren't there to make us happy, and adaptations that actually make us the opposite of happy are entirely plausible and understandable if we use evolutionary theory. So we'll talk a bit about what is the evidence that depression might be an adaptation, and what's the evidence that it's not an adaptation. Okay. So in the last few minutes, I'm just going to go over a couple examples of individual areas or types of studies that we would talk about in this class. One interesting area of EvPsych is 2D40. So it's the ratio between the length of your pointer finger to your ring finger. And prenatal testosterone influences this ratio. So if you have a low second to fourth digit ratio, which is a shorter pointer finger than ring finger, if you have a particularly long ring finger, that indicates higher prenatal testosterone levels. Men tend to have a lower ratio than women do. Women have about equally sized fingers. You measure from the little crease at the bottom here to the tip. So you can't just line them up and see, because this crease is usually different. All right. I would say low 2D40 in men at least is correlated with musical ability, athletic ability, heterosexuality. So homosexual men tend to have more feminine 2D40 ratios, and a bunch of other traits. So John Manning's done a lot of this research, and he actually did a TV show, and they asked him to predict, I think, 6 men how they were going to finish in a race. So there were 6 athletes. They were going to run a 100-meter race, and he measured all their 2D40s, and this never, ever happens on TV. Whenever I do anything on TV, the results turn out exactly the opposite of what they were supposed to. But John Manning got really lucky, and they finished exactly in order of their 2D40 from lowest to highest. Well, it's not actually in real life that good a predictor. It's significantly correlated, but certainly wouldn't give you. So don't go. Can you bet on human running races? Don't go betting on the Olympics based on 2D40. But again, here's an example of a heritable genetic trait. So testosterone levels prenatally are influenced by genes, but they're also influenced by the environment. Mother's stress, whether or not she's had previous boys. These things interact, and testosterone levels set up an environment that allows certain traits to develop or not develop. So perhaps everybody has the genes that, in the right testosterone environment, would allow them to develop more musical ability or athletic ability. And then their prenatal environment is also adjusting whether or not they're expressing these traits. So this is a really interesting area about how we might get individual variation in humans that could be adaptive based on interaction between genes and the environment. Another totally different bit of research that I'm really quite keen on is cross-cultural diversity in the use of spices. So Billings and Sherman do a whole bunch of research about why do people eat different things in different areas. Of course, part of it is what's available, what can you grow in that particular area. But even beyond that, sort of everybody can grow onions, but different cultures use them to different amounts. So they had a hypothesis that part of our cultural food preferences were due to variations in pathogens in the environment. So that you would sort of culturally evolve a system where you'd use more spices if your food was more likely to go off because it's a high pathogen, high temperature environment. So they looked at the use of spices by climate, by the average annual temperature in 32 countries, and found that for onions, garlic, and capsicums, so hot peppers, they found positive correlations. The hotter it was, the more people used these spices, and they controlled for, they used statistical methods to control for availability. So to make sure that that wasn't driving this entirely, just that if you're in a hotter climate, it's easier to get peppers. They've also looked at like meat and vegetable recipes separately, on the idea that meat's more likely to go off in a hot environment and make you ill, and therefore people should put more spices in meat dishes than they should in vegetable dishes, because vegetable dishes aren't as potentially dangerous, and found the same. So, again, making predictions about behaviors that they didn't know about before, went out and got traditional cookbooks from 32 different countries, coded all the recipes, and tested their predictions. So, again, evidence against this idea that evolutionary hypotheses might be unfalsifiable. Right, so I talked a bit about experimental economic paradigms. This is the famous prisoner's dilemma. I think the version in your notes is kind of backwards because it's with points instead of years in prison. But the prisoner's dilemma here is the idea that two people are caught robbing a bank or something. They've done something wrong, and they're put in separate rooms and told, you can confess to the crime or not confess. If you cooperate with the other criminal, so if you don't confess and you've cooperated with him because you and the other criminal have decided that you're not going to confess, you've agreed beforehand. So if you both cooperate, you both get a year in jail. But if you defect, if you confess and your partner doesn't, then you can go free and he'll get 3 years in jail. But if you stay silent and he confesses, if he defects, you'll get 3 years in jail and he'll go free. But if both of you confess, you both get 5 years in jail. I've done this backwards again, haven't I? Anyways, so prisoner's dilemma is a experimental paradigm that you use to sort of test, are people going to cooperate, or are they going to defect? It's better, actually, it's better to defect in that. So if don't look at the numbers there again. I've confused myself entirely, which I do every year. I change the numbers, I make it points, not years, and I get confused. Now it's years and not points, and I'm still confused. But anyways, we use kind of experimental economic paradigms like this to test human cooperation in the lab. So you set people up in pairs and have them play this game and see how often do they defect or cooperate. If they play with the same person over and over again, does it cause more cooperation, more defection? And you can do multi-person versions of this game where lots of people are trying to cooperate with each other, something we call the public goods game. So I always want to talk about public radio, but we don't have it here. I think we're all pretty much obliged to pay the BBC our license fee, aren't we, if you own a TV. Whereas in the U.S., we have national public radio, and you can decide. It's entirely voluntary to contribute towards it. And that sort of thing is what we call a common pool resource, a resource that everybody can enjoy. There's no way to say you can't listen to national public radio if you didn't donate, but that it's optional to contribute towards. And so if nobody contributes, then you don't get national public radio anymore, and nobody gets the benefit. But there can be free riders, people who don't pay the cost. They don't donate to the public radio, but they take the benefit. They listen to it anyways. And there are lots of models of the evolution of human cooperation. So one of the things that we do uniquely is cooperate intensely in large-scale societies among individuals who aren't genetically closely related to each other. And it's one of the major problems or questions in evolutionary psychology is, how do we maintain this cooperation? What sorts of psychological, cognitive adaptations do we have that allow us to cooperate with each other to these extents that most other organisms don't? Things like social insects, bees and termites cooperate to that extent, but they have a really unique genetic system where they're basically all related to each other. And actually, they're more like, each bee is like an individual cell in a single organism than it is like an individual person. So what is it about humans? What kind of psychological and social and cultural mechanisms do we have that let us do this cooperation? And we use experimental economic games like that to investigate it experimentally in small groups, and then you can change the paradigm. Like, are people more or less anonymous, and does that influence how we cooperate? So we'll have one lecture on cooperation in experimental economics. Another area that we're really obsessed with in EvPsych is kinship. And this is my personal area of research. How do people know who their relatives are? And what kind of cues do they use to figure out who's related to them? And how does that influence their social behavior? And the specific cue that I'm most interested in is facial resemblance. There's a lot of research on resemblance to babies. And the idea that really only makes sense from a biological evolutionary perspective, that fathers should care about babies' resemblance to them more than mothers should. Until extremely recently, women were 100% certain which babies were theirs. There's just no possibility of mix-up. You had a baby, it's yours. If it doesn't look like you, who cares? You know it's yours. Whereas fathers have a different problem. If there's a baby, well, you can use a lot of proximate cues. If you've never had sex with that woman, it's probably not your baby. If the timing wasn't quite right for conception, you can use that to guess. You can use parts of the mother's behavior to make a good estimate of how likely you are to be the father. But you can also use the baby's physical appearance to help with that estimate of how likely you are to be the father. And so fathers should care about baby's physical appearance more than mothers should. It shouldn't bother a mother at all if the baby doesn't look like her in the slightest. But it should bother fathers if we take this evolutionary perspective that it would be adaptive to put your effort and your resources into genetic relatives, because those are the individuals who share your genes. So if you have genes that influence your behavior, that make you give resources to genetic relatives, then individuals who inherit those genes will get the resources and become more numerous. Whereas if you had an alternate set of genes that influence you to distribute your resources totally randomly, or distribute your resources specifically towards non-relatives, then those genes that influence you to do that don't get passed on to anybody, because you're not putting as many resources into individuals who are getting those genes. So natural selection sets up the idea that we should care who our relatives are, we should want to support them, put resources into them, and if we do that, then any genetic influence that causes us to do that or influences us to do that will be passed on and be represented more in future generations than it would have otherwise. And that sets up, again, the basic premise of natural selection. Then future generations should be full of people who care about who their genetic relatives are and specifically give their resources to genetic relatives rather than other people. Because the people who did the opposite are less likely to have genetic relatives in the future. Anyways, so Daly and Wilson did a study where they asked people, who do you think your baby is most similar to? And doesn't care who the respondent is, whether it's the mother, the father, mother's relatives, father's relatives. Everybody thinks babies look like their dads. They even coded about 100 childbirth videos. So for, I think, a midwifery course, took videos of 100 different childbirths. For whatever purposes they did that. And Daly and Wilson they were my PhD supervisors. So I've heard this story from them. They were going to code them all as to what people spontaneously said about what the baby looks like. So if at any point somebody during the birth and just after the birth in those videos said, "Oh, the baby looks like daddy," then they would code that as somebody who it was, and that they said the baby looks like its father. Martin Daly got through one childbirth video and said, "That's it, I can't watch anymore." Margot Wilson coded the other 99 childbirth videos, and then they found that people do. If they spontaneously, nobody asked them, "Who does the baby look like?" Just total spontaneous post-childbirth chatter confirms people really think babies look like their dads. It's about at least twice as likely for people to say that the baby looks like the dad than like the mom or like other siblings. But do they? Do babies actually look more like their dads? Do babies have physical adaptations to try to look like their dads in an attempt to get parental support? Actually, probably not. Tons of research has been done on this. One study found that 2-year-olds could be matched to their fathers more easily than to their mothers, but no other study has found this. There are about 10 other studies that have looked at it. That babies really don't look much like anybody. It's quite hard to match them to either parent. But you can do it at levels slightly above chance, but it's no better for mothers or for fathers. So why do we have this sort of psychology that's trying desperately to reassure fathers that they do look like their babies? You can think about that. Would that be adaptive for mothers and other relatives and even the father himself to fool themselves into thinking that the baby looks like them even when the baby doesn't necessarily look more like them than like the mother? And if this is adaptive, how might you test it? How might you see if that's actually been subject to natural selection for that sort of cognition? These are sort of things that we'll talk about in class. All right, another quick example of, so not just babies and family kin recognition, but social behavior towards relatives. Again, this idea that if you're giving more social help, more resources to genetic relatives, that sort of behavior will be subject to positive natural selection. When you ask about people's, hypothetically, how likely would you be to give everyday type of help, like help somebody move house, versus life or death help, jump into a river to save them from drowning? For both of them, you find a negative correlation with, or actually it's a positive correlation, but the scale is reversed, with kinship. So you're more likely to help people who have a kinship 0.5. 0.5 is we'll talk about this in later lectures, but so 50% related, that you probably share about 50% of your genes with that person. So their parent-child relationship or full siblings share about 50% of their genes. 0.25 is maybe half siblings or aunts, niece, uncle, nephew. 0.125 is full cousins, first cousins, and 0 would be an unrelated person. So we just asked people hypothetically, how likely would you be to help? Their likelihood of wanting to help somebody, and they didn't say like a 0.5 relative, how likely would you be to help a 0.5 relative, but they said how likely would you be to help your full sibling or your mother or your cousin or your aunt or your nephew. And these things decrease with genetic relatedness. But you probably also think of a lot of other compounds there. You spend more time, you're more familiar with closer relatives, parents and siblings, than you are with aunts and uncles or than you are with cousins. So, again, preliminary research, but we can always think of more ideas to further test these. Really quick, I think we've just got 1 minute here. Other things, MHC, we'll talk about mating behavior, how MHC is a region of the genes that codes for part of your immune system. And if you have a bunch of similar copies of MHC or the same copies, your immune system's not as strong as if you have lots of different types of MHC, because each one codes for a protein that can detect different pathogens. And so if you can detect lots of different pathogens, you have a stronger immune system than if you have a bunch of redundant proteins that can all just detect the same pathogens. And people seem to be sensitive to MHC, which you can smell in other people's odor when they're making mate choices. But the oral contraceptive pill seems to disrupt this potentially adaptive behavior. So one thing that we're doing in the lab now is looking further at how the oral contraceptive pill might disrupt potentially adaptive mate choice. Other things like the menstrual cycle, might we expect when women are likely to get pregnant versus not likely to get pregnant? How might their mate choice differ? And using evolutionary hypotheses to make predictions about that. And this is the last slide. These are kind of how I want you to think about the topics that we're talking about in EBSCI. There's the three really main ones: mating, offspring, and altruism. So our social behavior with altruism is our social behavior with non-relatives. Offspring, our social behavior with our genetic relatives, actually, not just offspring. And mating is our social behavior with people with whom we want to make genetic relatives. How do they all fit together? When we talk about all the different subtopics of EBSCI, I want you to maybe not draw out maps like this, but really think about how do the different aspects fit together. There's certain things we'll talk about with health that will fit in about altruism. They'll be about mating. They'll be about offspring. Because your exam questions will often be about how do two different topics, how can we integrate them and learn about one from the other and how compare and contrast topics. All right, so I'll see some of you at least next week.